The galaxy had many monsters, but none of them compared to the Zavarathi, and every spacefaring species knew this as a fact written into the very laws of survival. They were dragons in every sense of the word, but far worse than any legend ever told on any world, because the Zavarathi were real, and they were perfect in their violence and their beauty and their terrifying ancient intelligence. They had armored hides that could shrug off plasma fire the way a human might brush away rain, and they had venom that could dissolve the strongest metal alloys ever forged by any civilization in the known galaxy. They had wings vast enough to carry them through the upper edges of a planet's atmosphere, where the sky turned black and the stars became visible. They had a psychic resonance so powerful that it could reach into the mind of any living creature and crush it like a hand squeezing a fruit until nothing remained but pulp and fear. Fleet gave their worlds a wide distance, and every galactic treaty that mentioned their name said the same thing, in different words. Do not approach, and do not engage, and do not provoke, and above all else, never ever go near a nesting mother. Surathix was the oldest and the deadliest of them all. She was 90 meters long, from the tip of her armored skull to the end of her bladed tail, and her body was covered in bone plates that had been scorched and cracked and healed and scorched again across centuries of territorial wars with rival matriarchs. And she had 6 legs, each one thick as a starship landing strut, and tipped with claws that could tear open a cruiser's hull the way a knife opens a letter. And her eyes were the color of molten copper, and they held within them the cold, patient intelligence of a creature that had watched civilizations rise and fall, and had never once been impressed. She had come to Ashkara VI to nest. It was a volcanic world, far from the main lines of any known territory, major trade routes, and rich with geothermal heat, which the Zavrathi needed to incubate their eggs. And the ground was covered in black ash, and rivers of slow-moving lava crawled across the plains like glowing orange veins in the body of a dying god, and the sky was the color of bruised iron, and the air smelled like sulfur and metal, and the deep, slow heartbeat of a living planet. Surathix had chosen a ridge of volcanic rock near a magma vent, and she had hollowed out a nest chamber with her claws, and lined it with minerals she had crushed between her teeth. And she had laid 7 eggs, each one the size of a human shuttlepod, and each one glowing faintly with the bioluminescent warmth of new life growing inside. She was tired in the way that only a mother can be tired, after giving everything her body had to the creation of something new. And her energy reserves were at their lowest, and her psychic field, which normally stretched across hundreds of kilometers, had pulled inward, wrapped around her nest like a blanket, and she was vulnerable for the first time in over 300 years. And that was exactly when the Zarathon hegemony came. They had known about the void site ore buried deep beneath the volcanic plains of Ashkara 7 for decades, but they had never been able to mine it because Sarathix had claimed the planet as her nesting ground. And no sane commander would challenge a Zavrathi matriarch on her own territory. But Overseer Kael'thin was not interested in sanity, and he was very interested in power, and the void site ore was the rarest fuel source in the galaxy, capable of powering weapons that could reshape the balance of power across entire sectors. He brought 40 warships, and he timed the assault perfectly. The first volley came from orbit, and it hit Sarathix before she even knew they were there. She roared, and the sound of it cracked the sky and shattered the windows of every ship within atmospheric range. Launched herself upward on wings that spread like thunderclouds made of black iron, and she fought them the way she had fought everything in her life, with total and absolute fury. She destroyed 17 capital ships in the first hour alone. Her claws tore through their hulls, and her venom melted their reactors, and her psychic scream sent entire crews into madness, clawing at their own faces and screaming in languages they did not speak. and she was magnificent and terrible, and for a brief shining moment it seemed like she might win. But there were too many of them, and she was too tired, and the eggs had taken too much from her. The concentrated fire of 23 remaining warships hit her from every direction at once, and the plasma bolts pierced her wing membrane in dozens of places, and kinetic rounds shattered 3 of her 6 legs, and a focused energy lance cracked the bone plates along her spine, and she screamed not with fury this time, but with pain. She fell from the sky like a burning cathedral, and she hit the volcanic plains so hard that the impact crater swallowed a kilometer of ground, and ash rose into the atmosphere in a column that could be seen from orbit. She lay there broken and bleeding, and her blood was iridescent like liquid starlight, and it pooled around her in rivers that steamed and hissed where they touched the hot ground. Overseer Kael'thyn looked down at her from his flagship, and he felt satisfied. He ordered the ground teams to begin mining operations immediately, and he did not order them to finish her off, because she was clearly dying, and wasting ammunition on a corpse was inefficient. And he did not order them to destroy the nest, because the hatchlings would die on their own without a mother, and wasting effort on doomed creatures was also inefficient. The Zarathan hegemony took what they wanted, and they left. And Surathix lay in the ash, and she could feel her life draining out of her with every slow, painful breath, that she could feel the heat of the planet beneath her, which had once felt like comfort, but now felt like a funeral pyre. And she turned her great head toward the ridge where her nest chamber sat, and she could hear them. Her hatchlings. They were hatching right now in the worst possible moment, and they were blind as all newborn Zavrathi were for their first week. And they were calling out with their tiny, undeveloped psychic voices, and they were afraid, and they were hungry, and they were alone. Surathix tried to move, and agony exploded through every broken bone in her body, and she collapsed back into the ash. She sent out a distress call then, and it was not a roar, and it was not a scream, and it was not a weapon. It was a mother crying for help. It traveled through the psychic substrate of space, faster than any light-speed communication, and it carried no words, because the Zavrathi did not use words, and instead carried something far more raw and far more universal. It carried the feeling of a parent who was dying, and who knew that her children would die after her, and who could not do anything to stop it. The signal spread outward in every direction, like a ripple in an ocean made of thought and grief and desperation. And the galaxy heard it, and the galaxy looked away, because that was what the galaxy had always done when something was too dangerous, or too inconvenient, or too far away to matter, and every species that detected the signal recognized it for what it was, and every species made the same calculation, and every species decided that the risk was not worth the reward, and that the Zavrathi were monsters after all, and that monsters did not deserve mercy. The signal kept traveling outward into the cold, dark spaces between the stars, where no empire claimed territory, and no fleet patrolled, and no one was supposed to be listening. Listening. A small ship with a small crew, from a small world that the galaxy had mostly ignored, was passing through an unmapped corridor of space, and every single human on board felt the signal hit them like a wave of grief, so powerful that some of them wept without knowing why. And the captain of that ship, a woman who had spent her life running toward the things that everyone else ran away from, heard a mother dying and children crying, and she made a decision that would change the galaxy forever. She turned her ship toward the signal, and she flew straight into the fire. The UES Meadowlark was not a warship, and it was not a flagship, and it was not the kind of vessel that anyone in the galaxy would look at twice if it passed them in a shipping lane. It was a mid-range exploration and relief ship, built for long-duration missions in uncharted space, and it had a crew of 47 humans, and it carried medical supplies, and geological survey equipment, and emergency shelters, and food rations, and a small fabrication bay that could print replacement parts for just about anything, and it had light defensive armaments that were good enough to scare off pirates, but not much else. It was the kind of ship that went to places no one else bothered with, and helped people no one else remembered, and it did this work quietly and without glory, because that was what its crew had signed up for. Captain Elena Vasquez stood on the bridge, and she gripped the railing, and she felt the tears drying on her face, and she did not understand what had just happened. One moment she had been reviewing a star chart, and the next moment she had been drowning in a grief so vast and so heavy that it felt like the entire universe was mourning. And she had seen in her mind, without knowing how she was seeing it, the image of something enormous and broken lying in ash, and something small and helpless crying in the dark. Every member of her crew had felt the same thing at the same moment, and the bridge had gone silent, and people had looked at each other with wide eyes and wet cheeks, and nobody had spoken for almost a full minute. Then Dr. Kofi Ajay, her chief xenobiologist, had broken the silence, and his voice had been shaking when he said it. "That is a Zavrathi distress signal." The bridge went even more silent somehow. Kofi pulled up the Galactic Species database and projected it onto the main screen, and the entry for Zavrathi was longer than the entries for most intelligent species, and almost every line of it was a warning. Tier 0 Extinction Level Apex Predator and Psychic Resonance Class Omega, and armored hide resistant to all known conventional weapons, and venom capable of dissolving military-grade alloys, and contact survival probability for non-Zavrathi species at 0.3%. The recommended protocol was one word long: run. Kofi looked at Elena, and Elena looked at the star chart, and the signal was still pulsing through her mind like a heartbeat that was slowing down, and she could feel it getting weaker, and she knew with a certainty that she could not explain that whoever was sending this signal was dying. She asked one question: "Are there children involved?" Kofi hesitated, and then he ran the signal through a deeper analysis, and he looked at the results, and he closed his eyes for a moment before he answered. "Yes, and they are newborns, and they are alone, and they will not survive without their mother." Elena turned to her navigation officer, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, and she gave the order: "Set course for the signal origin at maximum speed." Sarah looked at her, and Elena could see the fear in her eyes, and she could also see something else beneath the fear, which was the same thing that burned in Elena's chest: the stubborn, unreasonable human refusal to let something die when there was even the smallest chance of saving it. Sarah entered the coordinates, and the meadowlark leaped forward into faster-than-light travel, and the stars stretched into bright lines outside the windows, and the ship hummed with the effort of pushing itself harder than it was designed to go. The journey took 11 hours, and during those 11 hours, Elena assembled her ground team. She chose Dr. Kofi Ajay because she needed someone who could understand the biology of whatever they found down there, and Kofi was the best xenobiologist she had ever worked with, and he had a gentle way with alien creatures that came from genuine respect rather than academic curiosity. She chose Sergeant Tomas Reyes, her chief field medic, because Tomas had spent 15 years patching up broken bodies in war zones and refugee camps across 3 different planets, and there was no wound he had not seen, and no injury he could not treat, and he had hands that were steady, even when everything around him was falling apart. She chose Li Wei, her lead engineer, because Li Wei could build anything out of anything, and she had once repaired a ruptured reactor coolant line using nothing but cargo straps and a piece of a dinner tray, and she looked at impossible problems the way a sculptor looks at a block of marble, which is to say she saw solutions hidden inside the chaos. And she chose Corporal Aisha Okonkwo from the Marine Detachment, because Aisha was calm under pressure, in a way that went beyond training, and into something that seemed almost spiritual, and she had grown up on a farm outside Lagos, raising animals, had a connection with living creatures that Elena had always admired, and also because Aisha could shoot straight if shooting became necessary. All 5 of them were volunteers, And Elena made sure of that, because she would not order anyone to walk toward a Zaprathi. She held a briefing in the cargo bay, and she told them exactly what they were flying into, and she showed them the database entry, and she watched their faces as they read the survival probability, and she waited for any of them to say no. None of them did. Tomas cracked his knuckles and said he had treated worse patients probably. Li Wei started making a list of materials she would need. Kofi began studying everything ever recorded about Zaprathi biology, which was not very much, because no one had ever gotten close enough to study one and survived. Aisha simply checked her rifle, and then asked if there were baby animals involved, and when Elena said yes, Aisha nodded. Everything. The meadowlark dropped out of faster-than-light travel above Ashkara 7, and the planet filled the bridge windows like a wound in space, all black and red and smoldering, and the atmosphere was thick with volcanic ash, and the surface was scarred with lava flows and impact craters. Fresh impact craters. Elena could see the debris of destroyed warships scattered across the orbital plane, and her sensors detected the residual energy signatures of heavy weapons fire and plasma detonations. And she realized that a battle had been fought here very recently, and that whoever had fought it had come with serious firepower. Sarah ran a surface scan, and found what they were looking for almost immediately. One massive biological signature, lying motionless near a volcanic ridge, and its vital signs were fading slowly, like a candle burning down to nothing, and 7 smaller biological signatures clustered together in a hollow in the rock, approximately 200 meters away. From the large one and the small ones were moving erratically, and their heat signatures were spiking in patterns that Kofi identified as extreme distress. The hatchlings were alive, but they were panicking, and their mother was dying, and the distance between them might as well have been an ocean. Elena ordered the meadowlark into a low orbit, and she suited up with her ground team, and they loaded a shuttle with every piece of medical equipment the ship carried, and every fabrication material they could fit, and emergency rations, and water purifiers, and thermal protection gear rated for volcanic environments. As they descended through the atmosphere, the shuttle shook with turbulence, and the windows glowed orange from the heat, and the air outside was thick with ash that scraped against the hull like sandpaper, and the ground below them was a hellscape of black rock and red fire, and somewhere in that hellscape was the most dangerous creature in the known galaxy, bleeding out, waiting to die. The shuttle landed 300 meters from Surathix, because that was as close as the terrain would allow, and when the ramp opened, the heat hit them like a wall, and the air smelled like burning metal and sulfur, and something else underneath those smells, something sweet and strange that Kofi said was Zavrathi blood. They could see her from where they stood. She was enormous beyond anything the database had prepared them for, and she was broken in ways that made Elena's medic training scream in protest because no living thing should have to endure what had been done to her body. And she lay in a crater of her own making, surrounded by pools of shimmering iridescent blood that caught the volcanic light and reflected it in colors that had no names in any human language. And beyond her on the ridge, they could hear the hatchlings. Tiny voices that were not quite sound and not quite thought, but something in between, and they were crying. Was the most heartbreaking thing that any of them had ever heard, because it was universal and it needed no translation. It was the sound of children who were afraid and alone, and who wanted their mother. Elena looked at her team, and her team looked back at her, and nobody said anything, because nothing needed to be said. They were 50 meters away when the psychic wave hit them, and it was like nothing any of them had ever experienced or could have prepared for. It was not pain exactly, and it was not fear exactly, and it was something older and deeper than both of those things combined. And it reached into the most primitive part of their brains, and it grabbed hold of every survival instinct that evolution had ever wired into the human nervous system, and it pulled. Every cell in their bodies screamed at them to run. Tomas dropped to his knees, and his hands went to his temples, and his face twisted, and he made a sound that was not quite a scream, and not quite a moan, but something desperate and animal, and involuntary. Li Wei collapsed flat on her back, and her eyes rolled and her body went rigid, and she later said that in that moment she had felt like a small creature, standing in the shadow of something so vast that her mind could not hold the shape of it, and vomited, and then vomited again, and then straightened up and wiped her mouth with the back of her glove, and planted her feet and refused to fall. Kofi's nose began to bleed in two thin lines down his upper lip, and he swayed, but he stayed standing, and he whispered through gritted teeth that this was the Zavrathi territorial defense mechanism, and that it was designed to trigger the maximum possible fear response in any approaching organism, and that it was working very well. Elena felt all of it. She felt the terror flooding through her like ice water filling her lungs, and she felt her legs trying to lock up, and her hands trying to shake, and her vision trying to blur, and every thought in her head was the same word repeated over and over and over: run, 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 run. But Elena Vasquez had been a combat medic before she was a captain, and she had walked toward wounded soldiers while bullets cracked past her head, and she had held pressure on arterial bleeds, while explosions shook the ground, and she had looked into the eyes of dying people and told them they were going to be okay, even when she was not sure that was true. She knew fear, and she knew that fear was not a wall, but a door, and that you could choose to walk through it. She kept walking. Her legs trembled, and tears streamed down her face, and every step felt like pushing through deep water, but she kept walking. And she did something that no xenobiologist or military strategist or galactic diplomat would have thought to do. She held her hands out where the dragon could see them, palms open and empty, and she spoke. Not because the dragon could understand English, but because the tone of a voice carries its own meaning, and because the Zavrathi were psychic, and they did not read words, but they read intent, and they read emotion, and they read the deepest, truest shape of whatever was standing in front of them. Elena spoke the way she had spoken to wounded soldiers and frightened children and grieving families, and she said simple things in a calm, steady voice. It is okay, and I am here to help, and I am not going to hurt you, and you are not alone anymore. Surathix watched her come. The great dragon lay in her crater of blood and ash, and her copper eyes tracked this tiny creature that was walking toward her through a psychic field that should have sent it fleeing in mindless terror, and Surathix did not understand what she was seeing. In 300 years of life, she had encountered hundreds of alien species, and every single one of them had reacted to her psychic defense in exactly the same way. And they had run, or they had frozen, or they had died from the sheer overwhelming pressure of her mind against theirs. This creature was doing none of those things. This creature was weeping and trembling and clearly terrified, and it kept coming anyway. Surathix reached deeper with her fading psychic awareness. She touched the mind of this small being, and she searched for what she always found when she looked inside other creatures: hunger, or greed, or aggression, or the cold, calculating desire to exploit. She found none of those things. What she found instead was something she had never encountered from any species that was not her own. It was so unexpected and so foreign that for a moment she did not even recognize it. It was compassion, pure and simple and completely without conditions. It asked for nothing in return, and it expected nothing in return. And it was simply there like sunlight, or gravity, or the heat of a star, and it said, "I see that you are suffering, and I want to help." Surathix stopped the psychic assault. The pressure vanished, like a storm breaking, and Tomas gasped, and Li Wei sat up, and Aisha exhaled a long, shaking breath, and Kofi wiped the blood from his nose, and they all looked at each other. And then they looked at Elena, who was now standing within arm's reach of the most dangerous creature in the known galaxy. Elena placed her hand against the dragon's snout. The surface was hot enough to blister her palm, and she felt the pain register somewhere distant and unimportant. And she looked into that massive copper eye, and she saw something that broke her heart, which was exhaustion and despair, and the terrible knowledge of a mother who believed she was going to die and leave her children alone in a universe that did not care. Elena pressed her burned hand harder against the dragon's face, and she said, "I am going to help you, and I need you to let my team get close, and I promise we are not here to hurt you or your babies." A thought passed through Elena's mind then, and it did not come from her own brain, and it was clear and vast and ancient and sad. Why? And Elena answered out loud, because it felt right to answer out loud, because no one else was going to. The hardest any of them had ever lived through. Tomas assessed the dragon's injuries using portable biomedical scanners that were designed for creatures no larger than a human, and he had to recalibrate everything by factors of hundreds and thousands. And he worked with Kofi to map the alien biology in real time, figuring out which organs did what, and where the critical blood vessels were, and how the bone structure connected. And every answer led to 10 more questions, but they kept working because the alternative was letting her die. Li Wei contacted the Meadowlark and had them send down every scrap of fabrication material on the ship. She printed massive titanium alloy splints for the 3 shattered legs, and she designed custom clamps for the cracked bone plates along the spine. She reinforced the torn wing membranes with carbon fiber patches that she bonded to the living tissue using a surgical adhesive that Kofi formulated from the dragon's own blood. Chemistry. They worked in 60-degree heat with volcanic ash in their lungs and the ground shaking beneath them from aftershocks. And they rotated in shifts, but nobody actually rested during their off shifts because there was always something else to do, and always another wound to clean, and another bone to set, and another piece of equipment to modify. Elena authorized the use of their emergency fuel reserves to power the surgical equipment, and she authorized the dismantling of non-essential ship systems for raw materials. And she knew that she was stranding them here if anything went wrong, but she made the call without hesitation. Meanwhile, Aisha went to the nest. The 7 hatchlings were each about the size of a large dog, and they were covered in razor-sharp scales that were soft and flexible like the scales of a newborn snake, and they were blind, as all Zavrathi newborns were for their first week, and they stumbled and bumped into each other and cried with those small psychic voices that pulled at something deep inside her chest. They were starving. No human had ever fed a Zavrathi hatchling, and there was no manual, and no guide, and no protocol. So Aisha did what she had always done when faced with hungry baby animals, and she figured it out. She studied Kofi's hastily compiled notes on Zavrathi biology, and she calculated a protein and mineral ratio that should sustain them. And she synthesized a thick, warm slurry from ship rations and volcanic mineral supplements, and she welded a feeding trough from cargo container panels. And she sat down in the middle of 7 tiny dragons, and she fed them by hand. The first one that came to her was cautious, and it sniffed the air with nostrils that had not yet learned what food smelled like. And Aisha held the trough steady and made soft sounds the way she used to do with baby goats on her family's farm. And the hatchling dipped its face into the slurry and ate. Then the others came, and they jostled and pushed and climbed over each other and over Aisha, and their tiny claws scratched her suit, but did not pierce it, and she fed them all, and when they were full, they curled up around her, and against her, and on top of her, and they purred. It was a low, deep vibration that Aisha felt in her bones and in her teeth, and in the ground beneath her, and Kofi told her later that no Zavrathi had ever been recorded purring for a non-Zavrathi, and that she had just made interspecies history. Aisha said that was very nice, but right now she needed more protein powder because these babies were going to be hungry again in 4 hours. On the third night, Surathix opened her great eye fully, and she looked at Elena, who was sitting beside her head, covered in ash and blood and sweat, and running on nothing but determination and coffee. A thought formed in Elena's mind, clear and warm, and filled with something that felt like the first sunrise after a long winter. "Thank you." Elena smiled, and she pressed her forehead against the dragon's snout, and she closed her eyes, and she whispered, "You are welcome." The hegemony returns. 12 days passed, and in those 12 days the humans did not rest, and they did not leave, and they did not waver. Surathix was healing faster than any of them had expected, and Kofi said this was because the Zavrathi had a regenerative biology that was unlike anything in the galactic medical literature, and that her body was repairing itself at a cellular level that bordered on miraculous. But he also said, and he said this quietly so that only Elena could hear, that the healing had accelerated dramatically after the humans arrived, and he believed that the psychic bond forming between Surathix and the crew was somehow feeding energy back into her recovery. Her legs were still splinted with Leeway's titanium alloy braces, but she could stand now, and she could take slow, careful steps, and when she moved, the ground trembled beneath her weight, and the hatchlings, which could now see, because their eyes had opened on the 5th day, would run between her massive legs and squeak and tumble over each other in clumsy joy. The hatchlings had grown too, and they were already twice the size they had been at birth, and their scales were hardening, and their tiny wings were beginning to unfold like wet paper slowly drying in the heat. And they followed Aisha everywhere, not just near her, but touching her, and pressing against her legs, and climbing onto her shoulders, and nuzzling her neck with their warm snouts, and when she sat down they piled into her lap, even though they were already almost too big for that. And she let them, because she loved them, and they loved her, and love does not care about species boundaries. Kofi confirmed what everyone already suspected, which was that the hatchlings had imprinted on Aisha, and that this was a permanent psychic bond, and that in Zavrathi terms, she was now their kin guardian, which was a role that had never existed between a Zavrathi and any other species in recorded history. News calmly, and then asked if this meant she was legally responsible for 7 alien dragons. And when Kofi said that there was no legal framework for this situation, she said, well, someone had better write one then. Elena had sent a detailed report of everything that had happened back to United Earth Command, using the Metalark's long-range communication array. And she had filed a formal territorial protection claim over Ashkara V1 under the United Earth Sapient Wildlife Preservation Act, which was a piece of legislation that most galactic species had laughed at when humanity first introduced it, because the idea that humans would risk political capital to protect alien wildlife struck every other civilization as absurd. Nobody was laughing now. The Meadowlark remained in orbit, broadcasting the protection claim on all standard frequencies, and Elena knew it was a gesture more than a strategy, because one exploration ship could not actually enforce a territorial claim against anyone who wanted to challenge it, but she broadcast it anyway, because sometimes the gesture matters more than the force behind it. On the 12th day, the sensors detected a fleet dropping out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system. 40 warships arranged in an assault formation and broadcasting Zerathon hegemony identification codes, and at their center was the flagship of Overseer Kael'thin, who had come back to harvest more Voidside ore, and who expected to find a dead dragon and a silent world. Instead, he found a human ship in orbit and a protection claim on his communication channel. And when he ran a surface scan, he found something that made his 4 eyes narrow in confusion, which was the Zavrathi matriarch, standing upright, on legs that should have been shattered beyond repair, with her wings spread and patched with some kind of alien material, and 7 healthy hatchlings moving around her feet, and humans on the ground, walking among them, as if this were the most normal thing in the universe. Kael'thin opened a communication channel to the Meadowlark, and his voice carried the particular kind of amusement that powerful beings feel when they encounter something small and foolish standing in their way. He informed Captain Vasquez that humans had no legal standing in hegemony-claimed space, and that the Zavrathi were classified as fauna under galactic law, and not as sapient beings, and therefore no Wildlife Protection Act applied, and that she had 1 standard hour to withdraw her ship and her crew, or he would destroy them. And he said all of this in the calm, measured tone of someone who had never been told no. Aleda's response was broadcast on an open channel. Every ship in the Zarathan fleet heard it, and every relay station within 10 light-years picked it up, and it echoed outward across the communication networks of a dozen species, and it was recorded and archived, and it would be replayed in classrooms, council chambers for generations. This is Captain Elena Vasquez of the United Earth ship Meadowlark, and we are providing medical aid and protection to a sapient being and her children. And we will not leave, and you are welcome to try to make us. Kael'thyn cut the channel and ordered his fleet into attack formation. He had 40 warships, and the humans had 1 small ship with no meaningful weapons, and a dragon that was still healing. And in his calculation this was not a battle, but a cleanup operation. He was wrong about several things. The first thing he was wrong about was the dragon. Surathix had been listening to the communication through her psychic bond with Elena, and she understood not the words, but the meaning beneath them. And she understood that the small, fierce creature who had saved her life was now standing between her family and the same enemy that had tried to kill them. And she understood that Elena was not going to move. Inside Surathix, then, and it was something ancient and enormous, and it was the same force that had made her the deadliest creature in the galaxy, but it was focused now in a way it had never been focused before, because she was no longer fighting for territory or dominance or survival. She was fighting for her pack, and her pack now included humans. Surathix rose to her full height, and her wings spread across the sky, and the carbon fiber patches that Leeway had bonded to her membranes caught the volcanic light and gleamed like dark silver. And she roared, and the roar was not just sound, but psychic force, amplified by fury and gratitude, and the terrible protective rage of a mother who has been given a second chance. The roar hit the Zarathon fleet like a physical blow. Shields flickered across all 40 ships, and navigation systems scrambled, and targeting computers locked up, and crew members on every vessel experienced simultaneous waves of panic, so intense. Some of them simply sat down on the floor and refused to move, and the fleet's careful formation dissolved into chaos in a matter of seconds. But Surathix was not the only surprise. Behind the Zarathon fleet, space bent and twisted, and light folded. And the first ship to emerge from faster-than-light travel was the UES Thermopylae, and it was a battlecruiser with weapons that made the Meadowlark look like a toy. Then the UES Crazy Horse dropped in on the Zarathon flank, and it was another battlecruiser bristling with missile tubes and plasma batteries. Then the UES Boudica arrived, and then the UES Sitting Bull, and then the UES Spartacus, and then 12 more warships, each one named after someone who had stood against impossible odds and refused to kneel. The United Earth Fleet had received Elena's broadcast, and they had come fast, and they had come angry. Admiral James Mwangi stood on the bridge of the Thermopylae, gray hair and calm eyes, and he had served in the Earth Fleet for 35 years, and he had fought in engagements that would have made lesser officers retire. And he looked at the Zarathon fleet the way a teacher looks at a student who has made a very serious mistake. He opened a channel to Overseer Kael'thyn, and his voice was quiet and steady, and carried the weight of absolute certainty. The dragon is under our protection, and her children are under our protection, and this world is under our protection. And you may leave now, or you may stay and learn what happens when you threaten something a human has chosen to love. Kael'thyn looked at his tactical display, and he saw 15 human warships behind him, and a Zavrathi matriarch in front of him. and his fleet was still reeling from the psychic assault, and his shields were still flickering, and his crews were still shaking. He had come here to collect ore, and instead he had found something far more dangerous than a Varathon. Dragon, which was a dragon that had humans standing beside it. He ordered the retreat. The Zerathon fleet turned, and accelerated and jumped to faster-than-light speed, and the last thing that Kael'thas saw on his rear sensors, before the stars blurred, was the image of a massive alien dragon standing on a volcanic plain, surrounded by tiny human figures, and the dragon's wings were spread wide, as if sheltering them from the sky. Or as if they were sheltering her. He was not sure which, and the uncertainty of it bothered him for a very long time. On the surface, Aleida stood with her team, and they watched the Zerathon fleet disappear, and Tomas let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like an hour. And Li Wei sat down on a rock, and put her head in her hands and laughed, and Aisha stood with 7 hatchlings pressed against her legs, and she looked up at Seraphix, and Seraphix looked down at her, and something passed between them that did not need words, or psychic bonds, or any language at all. It was simply the understanding of 2 mothers who would burn the galaxy to keep their children safe. Admiral Mwangi brought the Thermopylae into low orbit, and he looked down at the volcanic world below him, and he shook his head slowly, and he allowed himself the smallest of smiles. He had joined the fleet to protect humanity, but today he had learned that protection was not something you kept only for your own kind, and that the size of your heart mattered more than the size of your ship, and that one stubborn captain with a beat-up exploration vessel had just changed the course of galactic history, because she heard something crying and could not walk away. He opened a channel to Elena, and he said 2 words. The news spread across the galaxy like fire through dry grass. And it spread not because governments wanted it to spread, but because the people of 100 different worlds heard the story and could not stop telling it. A dying alien dragon and her crying hatchlings, and a small human ship that turned toward the screaming when every other species in the galaxy turned away. The official channels tried to control the narrative at first, and the Zerathon hegemony released a statement calling the incident an illegal interference in sovereign mining operations, and the Galactic Council issued a formal notice of concern regarding humanity's unauthorized contact with a Tier 0 species, and several prominent xenobiologists from prestigious alien universities published papers arguing that the Zavrathi were not truly sapient, and that the humans had simply triggered an instinctive bonding response in a dangerous predator, and that the entire situation was reckless and irresponsible, and would inevitably end in tragedy. None of it mattered, because the story was bigger than any of them. Footage from the Meadowlark's external cameras had been included in Elena's original transmission to United Earth Command, and somehow it had leaked onto the galactic communication networks, and within a week, every inhabited world had seen it. They saw the 5 humans walking toward the broken dragon while the psychic assault hit them like a hurricane, and they saw 3 of them fall, and they saw Elena keep walking, with tears streaming down her face and her hands held open. They saw Tomas kneeling in pools of iridescent blood, with scanners in his hands, working to save a creature that could have killed him with a twitch of her claw. They saw Li Wei printing massive splints and climbing the dragon's body to attach them to her shattered legs, working at heights that would have killed her if she slipped. They saw Ayesha sitting in a nest of razor-scaled hatchlings, feeding them by hand, while they purred and nuzzled against her like kittens. They saw the moment when Seraphix opened her great eye and looked at Elena, and the moment when Elena pressed her burned hand against the dragon's face and said, because no one else was going to. That footage broke something open in the galaxy. Species that had never questioned the classification of the Zavrathi as mindless beasts began to wonder if they had been wrong, and species that had always prided themselves on their advanced civilizations began to feel something uncomfortable, which was shame, and species that had ignored the distress signal when it passed through their space began to ask themselves why they had looked away. Humanity did not gloat and humanity did not lecture, and humanity simply continued doing what it had always done, which was showing up when things were hard and helping when help was needed. In the months that followed, everything changed. Surathix healed completely, and her body, which had already been formidable, was now something new, because the titanium alloy reinforcements that Liwei had built into her legs made them stronger than they had been before, and the carbon fiber patches on her wings gave her a flight profile that was more agile and more efficient than her natural membranes had ever been. And Dr. Ajay ran tests and published his findings, and his findings shook the xenobiology community to its foundations. The Zavrathi were not animals. They were not beasts or monsters or forces of nature to be avoided and feared and classified as obstacles on a star chart. They were sapient beings with intelligence that exceeded most of the species sitting on the Galactic Council, and they had memory and emotion and language and culture and history stretching back tens of thousands of years longer than any currently existing civilization. And the reason no one had ever discovered this was breathtakingly simple. No one had ever asked. No one had ever approached a Zavrathi with anything other than weapons or fear, or the intent to avoid. And every interaction in recorded history had been violent or distant. And every conclusion drawn from those interactions had confirmed the assumption that the Zavrathi were dangerous, mindless predators. And it had never occurred to anyone that the Zavrathi might be dangerous and intelligent, and that those were not contradictory things. The Zavrathi had simply never met a species worth talking to. Until now. Surathix began sharing her memories with Elena through their psychic bond, and the things she shared were staggering in their scope and their implications. She shared star maps of regions that no galactic species had ever explored, and she shared knowledge of civilizations that had risen and fallen millions of years before the oldest current species had evolved. And she shared warnings about things that lived in the deep void between galaxies, things that were patient and ancient and hungry, and that the Gavrathi had been fighting in silence for longer than anyone could comprehend. The galaxy had spent millennia thinking the Gavrathi were its greatest threat, when in reality, the Gavrathi had been its greatest protectors all along, standing guard in the dark places where no one else dared to go. The 7 hatchlings grew fast, and they grew strong, and they grew with the knowledge of 2 worlds woven into their development, because they knew Gavrathi ways through their mother, and they knew human ways through Aisha, and they were something that had never existed before, which was a bridge between the most feared species in the galaxy and the most stubbornly compassionate one. Aisha Okonkwo was formally designated as the first human Gavrathi kin guardian, and she took the title seriously, and she raised those 7 hatchlings with the same patience and firmness and love. She had learned raising animals on her family's farm, and when people asked her if she was afraid of them, she laughed and said that anyone who had ever bottle-fed a baby goat at 3 in the morning knew that motherhood was motherhood, regardless of species. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session to address what they called the human Zavrathi crisis, and they demanded that Earth sever all contact with the Zavrathi immediately, citing the danger to galactic stability and the unpredictability of the species and the recklessness of humanity's actions. Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Council was Dr. Priya Sharma, and she was a small woman with dark eyes and silver hair, and she had spent her career building bridges between species that did not trust each other, and she stood at the podium and she looked out at the assembled representatives of 100 worlds, and she delivered a response that would be carved into monuments and taught in schools and remembered long after. The empires that heard it had crumbled to dust. She said, "You found a dying mother, and you walked away, and you heard children crying, and you covered your ears, and you saw a species you did not understand, and you called them monsters. And we found the same dying mother, and we held her hand, and we heard the same children, and we fed them, and we saw a being no one else had the courage to look at. And we saw someone worth saving, and that is not recklessness. And that is what it means to be human. The council chamber was silent for a long time after she finished. 3 months later, the Zavrathi began to move. Not one or two of them, but dozens and then hundreds, emerging from nesting worlds that had been marked as forbidden zones on every star chart for millennia. And matriarchs that had not been seen in centuries appeared in the space around Earth's borders. And they came with their young, and they came with their mates, and they spread their vast wings in the light of Earth, humanity's sun. And they did not roar, and they did not attack, and they did not threaten. They simply stood guard. The most powerful and most feared creatures in the universe had looked at the galaxy, and they had seen empires built on conquest and fear and exploitation, and they had seen species that talked about civilization while leaving the wounded to die and the helpless to suffer. And they had seen all of this for thousands of years, and they had never once been tempted to ally with any of it. And then they had seen humans, small, fragile, short-lived humans who could not survive a psychic assault without bleeding, and who could not withstand volcanic heat without protective suits, and who had no natural armor, and no venom, and no wings, and no claws, and who had absolutely no business walking toward a dying Zavrathi matriarch. And they had done it anyway. Not for profit, and not for power, and not for territory, and not because anyone ordered them to. Because they expected anything in return. They had done it because they heard something crying, and they could not bear to walk away. The galaxy had spent 10,000 years building empires through strength and through fear, and through the cold calculation of what could be gained and what could be exploited. Humanity built something stronger in 3 days on a volcanic rock, with bandages and kindness, and a stubborn refusal to let the cruel math of the universe go unchallenged. And the dragons remembered, and the dragons came, and nobody who threatened humanity ever slept well again. Because the galaxy could handle humans, and the galaxy could handle dragons, but the galaxy could not handle a species that had earned the love of dragons. And that was the thing about humans that no one else had ever understood until it was far too late. They did not conquer the most powerful beings in the universe. They simply loved them. Powerful beings in the universe loved them back.